Hello, welcome back to Stable Discussion. Today we're going to be talking about grounding your AI responses in reality. This ability for you to take this amazing capability of AI to be creative and this ability for it to come up with interesting answers and better tie those answers to a real valuable outcome. There are times where these AIs hallucinate. There are times where the information that they have might be out of date. And so when we're getting answers from AI, we need some way to validate that answer and see how close is that answer to a real answer that we'd expect. AIs can kind of be search tools for us, help us find where an answer might be, and we can use data to determine if that is a good path to go down. When I think about grounding, I'm thinking about maybe we're going on a journey and we've got a lot of potential destinations we could go to. Grounding helps us filter out some of those destinations that the AI comes up with so that we don't get lost along the way trying to get somewhere. One of the most well-known examples of a tool that does really great grounding is Cursor, and specifically inside of Cursor, the agent feature. And the agent feature is really the ability for Cursor to be able to act upon some command that you give. Cursor is, of course, this code editing tool that allows you to edit code. And so when you give it these commands, you're giving it commands to be able to edit code on your behalf. This is a really amazing tool. Now, the thing that it has to do that's different is it does need some ability to do this loop on errors thing. And why that's so important is when it kind of goes down a path of creating code in a certain way, it needs to validate that that code is valid. Hallucinations occur because APIs might not exist, or the AI may kind of have the incorrect assumption about how something should work versus the way that it actually works. And so being able to detect errors in the output of the code as this Cursor generates AI code is really valuable. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about like how we might think about grounding our applications in data and the ways that I've been kind of thinking about this in the products that I've been building. So let's talk through 5 different steps that I'll use to kind of ground an AI in reality. So step 1 for me is really like defining the problem, defining what are we trying to solve and how are we going to solve it. When it comes to an application like Cursor, really their core thing they're trying to solve is generate working code. That's really like at the core of what they're trying to do. And so by understanding that that's the kind of core underlying concept, we already have a really good starting point. This is just an important first step of problem solving in general, but I think it definitely is something that you have to go through when you're trying to think through, okay, when I have an AI and I'm trying to ground it with data, I need to understand the problem that I'm trying to solve when it comes to grounding. So when we think about generating working code, we're already kind of seeing, okay, I have this problem, I need to generate working code, how am I going to test that I've solved it? So that might actually be the second test, is like, I'm defining the problem plus how to test, right? When I've actually figured it out, right? So I'm going to generate working code, and then I'm going to say it passes my lint tests. That's kind of the main thing that Cursor really like checks for, right? So that's a good definition here. Step 2, we're going to now take this problem, we're going to start exploring the solution. So what you might do is you probably go into like your playground with an AI and just like test stuff out, right? See what an AI is capable of generating, see which models seem to give you the best results, just get a feel for what's happening and how it works, where are the difficulties, because there's nothing quite so difficult as building something and then having to try and figure out and debug why it's not quite working the way that you expected. Just by testing stuff out on a playground, and I really wish that I do this more earlier. Just by testing stuff out on a playground, it can really give you like, oh, right, okay, AI models are smart, but they may not know everything. This just kind of is a good like litmus test for figuring that out. Step 3, set up an AI to be creative on the kind of get-go. So we're thinking about how we solve these problems. How do we help the AI be a bit more creative? So for Cursor, one of their things that they do is they do a really good job of understanding the like code context. So they spend a lot of time indexing and understanding the code that you have that you're coding against and using that to better set up the AI so that it's going to be able to come up with better code because it's able to like reference the code that exists to come up with a better solution. That's a really great way to set things up to be creative, giving it the right context. There's a lot of other ways to think about this too. If you're doing something maybe a bit more creative, or you're trying to come up with an answer that's in a specific space, there may be other ways that you're going to kind of change the prompts a bit depending on the situation that guide it a bit more creatively. The fourth step is going to be leveraging real data for grounding, right? So in this, basically we have this loop that Cursor does where it actually like checks the lint outcome. It also occasionally when you're installing code, when it notices that there's a dependency missing, which it can kind of find through linting, it also checks that installs worked properly. And it'll check to say, hey, okay, did this install work as we expected? If it did, great. If it doesn't, okay, there's a problem there. And so this is a good way for you to be able to build this connection, right? Cursor's ability to have this agent is amazing. And it's really cool that the agent's able to self-reference itself to be able to kick things off. But there does need to be this integration on real data. That isn't an AI feature necessarily. It's just the ability for it to hook into an existing system. And then there's step 5, which is like really formatting and exporting. Sometimes, especially when you're doing the creative work here and you're leveraging the kind of real data for grounding, you may need to do some formatting just so that you have it in maybe a format that the real data can detect what is happening. You may need to do some just intermediary steps to be able to get that to tie in correctly. We'll describe more of this, but effectively this is kind of like your structured outputs, effectively. So these are the 5 general steps that I go through when I think about grounding, and this has worked fairly well for me. Some of these are definitely better than others, but I find that this is a very good set to go through when kind of thinking about this problem. Let's kind of just briefly touch on why this is important. If I have a series of AI calls that are going to happen back to back to back, right? I'm going to have some sort of basically like question potentially that I'm going to be giving my problem. And if I'm doing something interesting with AI like Cursor is doing, they're going to be making multiple calls, right? So I have these 3 different code generations that are going to happen with Cursor. And each of these generations is going to have some degree of success. So let's say that they're 90% successful at generating code. So this gets an output to this one gives its output to this one, and then at the end we get our final code. So you've got this nice kind of pipeline of how this data ties together. Now, the problem is when these are 90% accurate, the information that goes from this block to this block is now also 90% accurate. And so when we get a result out of this block, that's going to be 0.9 times 0.9. So that's going to be 81% accurate. So now there's a sudden degradation of the final quality and the likelihood that you're going to get the right answer. And then when you do it again, we're going to have 81 times 0.9 again, which is going to give you 72.9, so about 73% accuracy. And that's not great. And so when we think about building these agentic systems, and this is kind of the default way of going through things, we need some form of a ground, right? We need some check in here to be able to detect when was this a failure. And so what we'll do after every single one of these points, we will basically add a little retry loop. If it's in that 10%, right, we're going to try and detect this. We're going to try and say, hey, okay, let's try and see if we can figure out when this happens, when this is an error. And if we can determine it, retry. Let's rerun that code block. Otherwise, we'll continue on. And this effectively is grounding. That's what this blue piece is here. This is our grounding capability. And this will get us much higher. It'll be definitely better than 90% because we'll be detecting some of the errors that occur here. Now, the exact efficacy of this is something that you'll have to test with your system, how good your grounding is, what you're capable of. But generally, you'll get some benefit from improving your AI model at the beginning, having a better coding model. That will definitely be a good thing. But then grounding it into your answer is also a good thing to be able to now generate a better than 90% accurate code solution. So now we've got a kind of general idea of why grounding is important for us to do, and we've got a general framework for us to go through when we think through these types of problems. So I'm going to generate a vacation agent here. And so let's talk through how we're going to define and test this problem. I'm somebody who doesn't like to go to kind of the main key places when I'm on vacation. So I want to find places less traveled. And I want to say all of these places must have a 4.5 rating or higher. These places are less traveled, they have a high rating, and they must have mid to low activity, let's say. That's how we're going to kind of be able to evaluate whether these places are good places or not. So you can see here, I've defined my problem first. How am I going to test it? I'm going to find places that are less traveled. Let's actually switch these around here. Okay. It must have mid to low activity. It must have a 4.5 rating or higher. So those are going to be like some of the key criteria that I'm going to be using. Then we're going to think about exploring the solution. So let's go into the playground. I'm just going to boot up my playground here, and I'm going to say, act like an expert travel guide. Find me vacation destinations that are not too busy, but have a very good rating. I'd like to find specifically places in, and then you can kind of go on to your specific search criteria. First off, let's just kind of see what it does with this. So let's go ahead and run it with just this sort of information. Azores, Portugal, someplace in Laos, Kyoto, Australia. So it's definitely trying to promote a few different places. I wouldn't necessarily say, I mean, Kyoto's outskirts are, I guess, potentially a little bit less busy, but it's still close to kind of a busy area. So I don't want to find much tourism in these places, and would prefer to be around locals. Delete those two responses and then run that. So I am running GPT-4o, and I'm going to just go ahead and stop this, and I'm actually going to run this with O3 Mini instead. We are going to output it as a text object here, medium reasoning. That all looks pretty good. Okay, let me go ahead and let's try that instead. I have really just kind of been liking using O3 Mini a bit here and there. I don't find that it's always super accurate, but it is really good at getting a few high quality results versus a lot of different results. I have enjoyed that quite a bit. Okay, below are several different vacation destinations, on high quality but under the radar. So lots of islands, that's great. Let's include a few things. I'm an English speaker and would prefer to be able to communicate somewhat with the people who live here. And because we're going to be using the O3 Mini model, I'm going to do think thoroughly about your answer. And let's see if that makes a big difference. We are able to give it this reasoning effort ability already, but let's give it a little bit of a go here just to kind of see how things go. So again, we've got Portugal, Tasmania, Faroe Islands, some area of Scotland. It is Scottish, so of course it's hard to say. So this is pretty great. Okay, so it does talk a little bit about tourist-friendly areas speaking English. I already think tourist-friendly kind of defies some of the things I said before, but hey, Australia is English-speaking, that's true. A good portion of locals speak English, that's great. English is one of the primary languages of Scotland. Okay, cool. Yeah, so it definitely catered a bit more toward my language. So say I do Korean instead. Now I think we're going to get some very different answers, is what I would expect. Yeah, it very much focused on Korea. It did not focus quite so much on the rest of the world, which is interesting. If I do German, so yeah, I would say Korea is kind of like intermittently known in places, but not kind of central in a lot of different regions. German is more kind of well spoken throughout. So yeah, now we've got more Italy, some Austria, Switzerland, Bavaria, Germany. Okay, cool, interesting. So areas sort of near Germany. If I do Spanish, I'm kind of curious if it would expand it very far. Ecuador, we got kind of close here. Yeah, interesting. So now we've got at least one kind of additional feature added in. Let's add one more. So now I'm giving it some additional criteria, combinations of mountains and water, and a specific season when it needs to be warm. There's Oman, there's Cyprus, Canary Islands, additional considerations of places. Oman, Cyprus, quieter Canary Islands. Interesting. Okay, cool. So I really like how O3 Mini did with this. I think this is great. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the formatting of this. So now we need some way to be able to kind of validate, hey, are these actually good destinations for us to go to? We're going to use GPT-4o, and we are going to get back a JSON object. And what I want are, give me the suggested destinations that were recommended based on the discussion above. And I am going to do JSON schema and generate this. So I want a JSON object with a list of destinations to research, as well as reasons for being included. Destinations, name, string. Cool. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a prompt here. So now we've got our object. Not quite what I was looking for. I've actually never used this before. This is really cool. Name, place, reason, something like that. I think is actually more closer to what I'm looking for. So let's see what it does. So now we've got an object that has destinations, and it has an array, and that has name and reason, and then those are required and it's strict. Cool. Okay, this looks really great. So I'm going to save that as my schema. We're going to run this with that schema attached for GPT-4o. And this is going to be able to like format for us the different places that we're going. Now we've got our name of the region, some of the reasons why we're going there. Yeah, this is great. So now we've got a nice formatted structure here that we can then use to kind of ground these as, okay, are these valid answers, right? We have some information about the weather. We have some information about which languages are spoken here. These are things that we could validate by maybe potentially using these against like a Wikipedia. But the thing that we're looking for is mainly the tourist destination. So how can we maybe think about those sorts of things? So that's kind of the next step that we're going to go through here, is now taking these and being able to compare them against the real data that we can get back for these destinations. So we've actually set up our vacation agent to be very creative. We're thinking about language, purpose, and season. So these are three really good things to be thinking through. And then additionally, as we start looking into like leveraging real data for grounding, we really be looking at APIs. Now, I've done just a cursory glance at some of the different APIs available. One that I do kind of like is this Amadeus API for developers. I think this is mainly aimed at large enterprise flight companies. And so it's kind of a bit of a lockdown solution here. Additionally, there's like UN Tourism, which does have a bunch of travel data and statistics, which we can use. It has a lot of details about like how many inbound flights were arriving at different countries. And we could use that to kind of get some sort of grounding about how many people are traveling to different destinations. This is, of course, really broken down by country largely. I haven't seen any of the data in here. And when I kind of download their spreadsheet, not a lot of this kind of tells me much about the specific cities. Arrivals by country, expenditure in country, trips, accommodation, departures. Anyway, so you can kind of see it has a bunch of data, but the availability of that data is kind of hit or miss. And then, of course, I was kind of looking through like maybe TripAdvisor as well, which can give us some kind of feel for some of these as well. But TripAdvisor does have an open API that you can use. If I had some more time and resources to really dive into this, I would be looking at like how to use these APIs to pull out things like a location score, which can give me some different details about the sites, the restaurants, how good these locations are, that's potentially a great way of kind of grounding the model from Amadeus, just to give us some sort of feel there about, okay, how good are these destinations really for tourism? Unfortunately, even their test data is only partially available, and so it doesn't necessarily help us to be able to fully test things out here. This is kind of like begins to be the problem that you really start trying to solve is, okay, how do we ground this thing in good data? That becomes kind of the difficulty here. And then you kind of already saw how I kind of did some formatting, right? Like even just kind of looking in the playground here, running through, building out this schema, you're kind of seeing how I'm able to kind of format that data. And we might go through another pass of this again, where we use kind of a 4.0 model to organize the data into a response. And so this is kind of the process of how we ground an AI application. You can also, of course, use the Gina Reader API. They have a new kind of grounding tool as well for fact checking. That's another interesting opportunity for using AI for grounding as well. However, I don't trust that nearly as much as I would real data if you can get it. So all in all, this gives you an introduction to how we think about grounding and how we can kind of work through these types of problems to come up with a solution where AI can really be leveraged to do something real for us. This isn't crazy capabilities where we're kind of crossing our fingers and hoping the AI figures it out. This is us actually like leveraging the AI and being able to kind of tie it back to a real outcome. I think eventually in the future, we might be able to kind of show off, maybe on a different example, how I'm doing some sort of grounding. I've got a couple other tools that I've kind of been working on that might be a better example of this, but this just gives you an idea for how to work through the problem and where the difficulties are. Grounding is a hard challenge, actually, when you really think about it. And while I did a lot of cool stuff with AI, the stuff that really took a long time was thinking through, okay, how am I going to get at an API that gives me the data I need to be able to validate these sorts of results. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you like what we're kind of doing here and you want to find more about us, you can find us at blog.scablediscussion.com. Thanks so much for tuning in.